we're using the same tools to regulate gene expression, regardless of where we are on the life continuum. And we want to therefore be thinking about eating for our genes. We want to be engaged in gene whispering lifestyle practices and dietary patterns that optimize expression really from preconception on. So I would argue that there's no time we don't want to be thinking about these tools. There's no time that we don't want to be introducing some of these habits and foods and so forth to our kids. But I would say that, it's interesting. So when I wrote the book, I said that probably, we're doing pretty well up until our 40s. That was my that was my conclusion on my read in the literature. But if we really want to be healthy centenarians, if we really want to live, to be 120, I would say that we want to engage in this information as young as possible. And when you look at the literature, so I talk about the overcalyx study or region in the book, and this is the overcalyx cohort is a population that has been tracked very carefully with copious data since the 1800s, and they're a farming community, and they could track health outcomes with lots of food, when they had a good harvest year, and insufficient food when they had bad harvest years. And they could track health. They just track data so carefully. You can look at health outcomes across the generations, and you can see the influence on gene expression when prepubescent boys. So this is altering spermatogenesis. This is altering information on the sperm. This is altering epigenetics on the DNA of the sperm. In prepubescent boys, in that first overcalyx generation, actually influenced health outcomes generations down. So too much food intake influenced generations down, and this is pre-puberty. And we know
crazy. It
is crazy. But we also know that, and this, I know it's crazy, and yet we also know that it happens. Certainly in early infancy, we can see all sorts of, it's not surprising, adverse childhood events will, predictably alter genetic expression and, increase risks of addiction and depression and mental health, but also inflammation and the chronic diseases of aging. So these early experiences can definitely alter epigenetics, towards the better or not. So conversely, so going back to this overcalyx cohort, so prepubescent boys with too much food, so they had fabulous farming, and I guess maybe they had lots of bread and butter on the table or whatever, just more caloric intake, had poorer health outcomes. But the less caloric intake actually had better. So they weren't starving, because starving will set up a whole nother very negative phenomena. So it was almost like they were forced, modest caloric restriction. So not quite starvation, but less food. And the prepubescent boys who consumed less food actually had better health outcomes, and subsequent generations also had better outcomes too. So that doesn't mean that you necessarily want to put your 11-year-old on a time restricted eating structure.
Do not put your 11-year-old on a TRE. Yes, do not do that. Right? Yeah.
But it just shows you the power of nutrition in regulating gene expression throughout the lifespan. Yeah, it's extraordinary.
And in your book, you talk also about the is it called the Dutch Winter? It's when the Germans blockaded the So Dutch Hunger Winter, that was during World War II, and they shut off access to this this very specific region, and they were starving. So they were subsisting on little to no food. And women who were pregnant, not siblings, but women who were actually pregnant, gave birth to babies who had increased risk for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, I think schizophrenia, but like the chronic disease of aging that we see. So there's this thrifty epigenome type. So they hung on to every calorie. So once they had food availability, their bodies were hardwired epigenetically to
hang on to calories, and not just that first generation of offspring. Actually, that would be generation one. So the pregnant moms were generation zero, and so that was generation one. Subsequent generations, they tracked this pattern, over multiple generations, and it's related to DNA methylation and epigenetics.
Yeah. Yeah. So to your point, you can have the overconsumption, the mild CR, the mild caloric restriction, and then you can go again to the other end of the spectrum with starvation. And we can see with dysregulated nutrient sensing in the body, how that can lead to epigenetic changes, like the thrifty gene you were talking about in the Dutch famine.
Yeah.
Dutch winter.
Let me tell you this. I think a lot of us in the United States, many of us are, relatively recent migrants to the U.S. I mean, I think it was my great grandparents who came from Poland, and I write about this in the book. A lot of us probably have some kind of a thrifty epigenome. I mean, if you look in the U.S., what's the percentage of individuals here that are at least overweight? Over half I think 60%. How many of us are on the metabolic continuum? It's like a river pushing us down towards diabetes, and heart disease and cancer and dementia. That is the trajectory. Yes, some of that is our sedentary lifestyle. Some of that is the standard American diet, of course. And we probably have some inherited patterns. We can actually look at Native Americans. We can look at African Americans and see similar disruption. So like Native Americans were, sequestered into reservations and given like flour, just given, horrible processed food, and taken from what they were, what they evolved consuming, and just developed diabetes just, in spades overnight. And so you see this phenomena elsewhere. But I think all of us probably have some kind of or many of us, I shouldn't say all of us, but some have some sort of inheritance pattern. And we need to really put our minds to fighting that river. And we can make those changes.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, because I have part of my background is Mediterranean. So my father was born in Portugal and migrated to Canada when he was young. And the standards of beauty, because he grew up very, very poor, so we also have like most of my cousins, my grandmother certainly, and my aunts. When they came here, of course, we have this abundance of food. There's no, like they weren't in, sort of mountainous or like, villages where, they didn't have the money to buy, whatever. And they've all become, I would call it morbidly obese. Yeah. And it's interesting. This is kind of a side topic, but it just popped in my head as you were talking. Also, what we consider, or I remember my grandmother, when I was younger, she would cry when she would see me because she was like, "You're too skinny." Like she was so afraid. And every European grandmother can, like, if anyone here has like, Italian or Greek or Spanish, like she would like pinch my wrist here. And if she couldn't get anything, she was like, "Oh my God, like you're starving, you're going to die." And so the standards of beauty for a Portuguese woman, and of course we know this sort of translates as well into South America as well, is like a larger woman is typically, maybe she's richer. Like there's like this, like, oh, she has a bigger butt,
right.
Like she's better because she has food to feed it. Right. So just, the beauty standard, it's also that I think that there's also some interconnectivity there as well, because with at least I can just speak for the, sort of what I've observed in growing up in a blended family, but some Portuguese influence there, is that the bigger your bottom is, right? Like the bigger your booty. It's always been, I mean, now of course we have the Kardashians and stuff, but like before it was, growing up in Canada, that was when I was younger, it was like Kate Moss, she was the reign supreme. But my culture, where we come from, is like bigger is better. It means you have food. It means you're kind of like,
you're going to survive. Basically, survive. I mean, it comes from, there's a rational background to that, even if it's gotten a little out of hand. My family also, coming from Poland, like my grandparents had a delicatessen, and, there was just endless pierogies, and just excess amounts of
Or it's just like it's like the prototypical, Italian grandmother that's like, mangia, like have some more, like have another thing, Okay. So we've talked about one hallmark of aging, which is like dysregulated nutrients, right? Input. Can we talk about some of the other hallmarks that we see in aging? I know that there's like genomic instability, which we're going to talk about. There's telomeres. Do you want to touch on some of the other hallmarks of aging, and then we can kind of move into the deep epigenome?
Well, so what I would say is, there's a handful of hallmarks of aging. I have focused most of my attention on epigenetics. So we know that there's a protein misfolding, and of course genomic instability, cellular senescence. What else is there? Oxidant stress, inflammation.
Right.
I haven't studied those as carefully as I have epigenetics. And the reason is, so epigenetic disruption, epigenetic changes are one of the hallmarks of aging. But I'm convinced, as I said earlier, I alluded to earlier when I said aging appears to be a program phenomena. If we're looking at root cause, I think that of the hallmarks, probably epigenetics is root cause, or it's the best thing we have to point to root cause. And the rest of the changes are downstream of the epigenetics. So the epigenetics, which is driving gene expression, drives these downstream changes.
Right. Yeah. So if we have this programmable, in the same way we were talking about this embryogenesis, programmable development of the embryo leading to the baby. Yep. And then now, based on what you're saying, we have this programmable aging. What is happening to the epigenome? So let's talk a little bit, first maybe a definition of methylation. And I'd like to maybe wade into the sirtuin waters as well, but let's talk, if you want to go there. But I think let's talk about methylation, and let's talk about how we start to, what are some of the maybe drivers of this epigenetic degradation?
So I mean, again, you could, so if you want to think about it from sort of the standard, I think the standard current scientific thinking is that these changes are wrought by, the slings and arrows of life. So inflammation is turned on. Actually, there's another idea that, that genes that we need on, that promote growth and vitality and the good things of youth.
Like mTOR?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. mTOR. Yeah. So those things that drive development in our youth, we peak out, you can sort of see a bell curve. They drive forward for a while and they're beneficial. Mm-hmm. And then they actually become damaging to us. And so, blood sugar control and all of the, increased risk of cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, et cetera. All of these phenomena, these pro-growth changes become detrimental and drive the aging process. So that's another school of thought around aging. Actually, it's a pretty well accepted school.